There are multiple approaches to writing processes. So one of them is called the plotter, and they plot everything and they have this outline and it is all perfectly planned. And the other is the pantser, and that means that they just write and the story goes where the characters take them. And the vast majority of writers are somewhere in between those two, and it looks very different. So my writing process is when I think of a story, I will chew on it for a couple days or sometimes a couple months. I have found that if I make myself chew on it for at least a week or two, that I kind of get to know the characters in my head, and it's easier once I sit down and I just write out the plot or the story. And what I'll do is I'll actually just write 5,000 to 10,000 words in a day or two where I'm just telling, this happens here, this happens here. And that's when I'll say, these are the goals in this scene. This is this character's goal. That is that character's goal. And I'm just telling. I am not showing. And I'll go into that in just a minute. Now then I'll go through and I'll just quickly put in the beat points. And I'll make sure that they generally line up in the right spot. That there's some kind of false victory or a defeat around the 50% point that causes the hero to start to learn the theme. Make sure that there is a climax around where a climax should be. And then after that, that's where I will actually start skipping around. And the next part is where I get into the character's head and I start showing. And this part can take anywhere from 5 weeks to 3.5 years on one of my books. And what I'm doing there is I'm working through, well, the character has to forgive the other character, but how do you forgive? What is your thought process, and how does that work in the Christian life? What would perhaps hold them back from forgiving? Is it going to be their pride? Is it an idol? And that is where I have to let it start tearing me up and teaching me. And this is where I start to have to be honest before the Lord about areas that I am struggling with, as I've already talked about a little bit. And it's in the getting into the character's head and recognizing my own blind spots over that period of time and recognizing that my faith is going to show through in it. So the original reason that Katie and I started talking about me doing this presentation was specifically so that I could kind of go through how to write a memoir or testimony. The problem is I'm not the best expert at this part, and also it's just really, 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 really hard for a couple of different reasons. So I've been working on a memoir of how my family came to faith for almost 5 years, and it is nowhere near done. So let me touch on a couple reasons why testimonies are hard, but also why they are so incredibly powerful. Number one, when you are doing a testimony or a memoir, there are 10,000 things that God has done in your life and shown you. And yet, to write a testimony or memoir most effectively, you need to narrow it down to the top one lesson learned. What was the primary lie that held you back in learning the lesson God had from you? And what was the primary truth that He taught you? And to narrow down to one thing is almost impossible, and yet it does make the most effective memoir or testimony, because like any other story, you are showing you're wrestling between one lie and one truth that God obliterated that lie. Now, if you do think through your life, you can usually get it down to one primary thing that everything else circled around. But it is hard. Now, number two, in a testimony, there are times when you are actually like the antagonist, because God is actually the protagonist, and you are often fighting God. And as you come to terms with that and admit that, it can make you feel very, very vulnerable. So the most effective testimonies are the ones that you feel like you're just ripped wide open and everybody gets to see. Now, the other things on testimonies is just when you start thinking about it from the beginning, there are different snapshots of your childhood or snapshots of yourself before you learned the truth. And they aren't always the snapshots that come to your mind first. We had talked on the night that the ladies came here about Tom's incredible testimony and a couple of the ways that he showed his anger as a child, and how that snapshot held with all of us. And then he was able to show how God set him free from that anger. So I can think of lots of different times when I was a kid, but one that I've thought about showing was how I would have nightmares about hell as a child, because I was so afraid that I hadn't prayed the prayer right, because I was raised in an inner city Keswick theology kind of church. And so the snapshot that you think of may not be the first one, but it's the one that shows you have to learn the theme. And as you continue going through, it will awe you how much God has done. And the more willing you are to be open about what it was that held you back and recognize that He is the one who was working and is still working. And that is the last thing that makes testimonies difficult, because we would like to say a happily ever after, and now I don't struggle with that lie every day. But the fact is we do. We all know that yesterday we yelled at our children, or in my case, like an hour ago. And we would like to say that it's all learned and we're all better. But the problem is we are still sinners, and until we see Him face to face, we do still struggle daily with sin. And so at the end of a testimony, to show a snapshot of how God has freed you from the enslavement of that lie, while still recognizing that He is still working, and pointing your listeners or readers to rejoice that He is also right now presently working in them.